In September of 1854, a ship carrying some of the most prominent families in America was racing home across the North Atlantic. The crossing had gone smoothly. The passengers were relaxed. Some, already mentally home, planning their dinners, their reunions, the stories they'd tell. The SS Arctic was the crown jewel of the Collins Line, the American answer to British dominance of the transatlantic trade. She was fast, luxurious, and built to make the old world feel the weight of the new. She never made it back. And what happened in the hours after the collision? Not the collision itself, but what the men aboard chose to do would kill over 320 people out of roughly 400 on board. No woman survived, not a single child. This is not a story about ice or fog or bad luck. This is a story about what human beings do when civilization strips away and survival becomes the only instinct left. It's a story America buried quickly and quietly, because the truth was far too uncomfortable to keep on the front page. Let's go back. The Collins Line was Edward Knight Collins' obsession and his masterpiece. In the late 1840s, the British Cunard Line was humiliating American shipping. Their steamships were faster, more reliable, and had become the prestige option for transatlantic travel. Collins, backed by a U.S. government mail contract that gave him close to $4 million over a decade, built for massive steamships designed to do one thing: beat the British at their own game. The SS Arctic was launched in 1850. At over 2,800 tons. She was enormous by the standards of the time. She was fitted out with luxuries that bordered on the theatrical, carpets from Brussels, rosewood furniture, private staterooms, a dining saloon that could make you forget you were at sea. She was also fast. Very fast. She held crossing records, and she knew it. By the summer of 1854, the Collins Line had become a point of American pride. The Arctic and her sister ships had beaten Cunard's times repeatedly. Newspapers celebrated each crossing like a sports victory. There was talk of America's manifest destiny extending to the sea lanes. On September 20th, 1854, the Arctic departed Liverpool, carrying around 390 passengers and crew. Among them were the wife of Edward Collins himself, his son, and his daughter. The ship's captain was James Luce, a seasoned mariner with a strong reputation. The first 4 days of the crossing were unremarkable. The weather turned foggy as the ship entered the Grand Banks off Newfoundland, a region notorious for poor visibility and heavy traffic. Standard procedure at the time was to reduce speed in fog. The Arctic did not. At around noon on September 27th, in thick fog, traveling at near full speed, the Arctic was struck by a smaller French vessel, the Vesta. The collision was almost accidental in its absurdity. The Vesta, a iron-hulled, propeller steamship, hit the Arctic on her starboard bow. The impact tore through the Arctic's wooden hull below the waterline. 3 of the Arctics were watertight compartments. Compartments that were not actually watertight, as events would prove, were immediately compromised. Here is where the disaster truly begins. Not with the collision, with the decision made 30 seconds after it. Captain Luce looked at the Vesta and made a calculation. The French ship appeared, at first glance, to be in worse shape. Her bow was badly damaged. He believed she was sinking. He also believed incorrectly, catastrophically, that the Arctic's damage was manageable. He ordered full speed ahead, away from the scene, toward the Canadian coast, hoping to beach the ship before she went under. What he didn't yet know, what his crew was only beginning to understand, was that the Arctic was flooding far faster than anyone had anticipated. The force of her own engines, driving her forward at speed, was pushing water through the breach like a hose. Every knot she made toward shore was also another knot of water flooding her hull. The pumps were engaged. The engineers worked furiously. And then the pumps failed. The pumps on the Arctic ran on steam. Steam required the boilers. The boilers sat low in the ship, in compartments now filling with seawater. As the water rose, the fires under the boilers were extinguished. As the boilers went cold, the steam pressure dropped. As the steam pressure dropped, the pumps stopped. As the pumps stopped, nothing stood between the Atlantic Ocean and the men, women, and children on board. The engineers knew this before the passengers did. The stokers knew it. The firemen knew it. And that knowledge, that private, technical knowledge, is what made what happened next possible. There were only 6 lifeboats on the Arctic. 6. For nearly 400 people. This was not unusual for the time. The prevailing assumption in 1854 was that a ship of the Arctic's size would never sink fast enough to require a full evacuation by lifeboat. The protocol was to use boats to ferry passengers to a rescue vessel. The idea of an entire ship's company abandoning ships simultaneously was considered almost theoretical. It was no longer theoretical. The crew began lowering boats, but something was wrong from the very first moments. The lifeboats were not being filled with passengers. They were being filled with crew. The engineers, the stokers, the sailors, men who knew the ship was going down and knew it faster than the passengers did, were taking the boats. One boat was lowered with 40 crew members and no passengers whatsoever. Another was swamped almost immediately after hitting the water because too many men rushed it at once. A third was launched with a handful of crew and immediately rowed away from the ship. The scene on deck was becoming chaos. Passengers who had been calm, who had trusted the crew, trusted the captain, trusted the order of things, were now watching their only means of escape, rowing into the fog without them. Some passengers tried to build rafts from deck furniture and wood. Some clung to the railing. Some did nothing, because the mind shuts down when it cannot process what it is seeing. Captain Luce himself was swept overboard during the final minutes and survived by clinging to wreckage. He would later testify extensively about what happened. His account is one of the primary historical records of the disaster. Here is the number that should stop you cold. Out of approximately 390 people aboard the SS Arctic that day, around 86 survived. The survivors were almost exclusively male crew members. Not one woman survived. Not one child. Let that settle for a moment. In a maritime culture that would later make women and children first into something approaching a sacred law, the Arctic produced the precise opposite outcome. Every woman, every child, dead, among the dead. Clara Collins, wife of Edward Knight Collins, Henry Collins, the founder's son. Marianne Collins, his daughter. The man who built the ship, the man who had staked his fortune and his pride on proving America's dominance at sea, lost his family to the very failure of the human systems that ship was supposed to represent. Now, here is the uncomfortable question the disaster forces us to ask. Were the crew members who took those boats monsters? It would be easy to say yes. It would be satisfying even to point at them, to name them, to reduce this catastrophe to the moral failure of identifiable villains. But that is not actually what the historical record suggests. And it's not what the pattern of disasters like this one teaches us. The crew members who took the boats were not uniquely cruel men. They were not sociopaths. They were men in an extreme situation, with access to information that the passengers did not have, and with a physical proximity to the only means of escape that the passengers did not possess. They knew the ship was going down fast. They were near the boats. They had no training, no protocol, no clear order telling them what to do. And so they did what almost anyone does in the absence of a system. They saved themselves. This is the critical insight. The women and children first. Norm. What historians call the Birkenhead drill, named for a British troop ship that sank in 1852, was not a natural human instinct. It was a trained behavior. It was a protocol, explicitly enforced by officers with weapons in the case of the Birkenhead, who held their men at gunpoint while women and children were loaded into boats. Without that protocol, without that enforcement, the data is grim. When people panic, the strongest and most informed survive. That is not justice. That is physics. The Arctic had no enforced protocol. The officers lost control almost immediately. And in the absence of enforced order, the outcome was exactly what you would expect from a group of scared, poorly trained men who knew too much and were too close to the only escape. The response in America was initially one of shock, then grief, then something more complicated. Silence. The newspapers ran the story for weeks. There were investigations. Congressional hearings were proposed. Edward Collins himself, who had lost his wife and 2 of his children, continued operating the line until a series of further disasters and the loss of his government subsidy finally ended the Collins line in 1858. But the deeper reckoning, the structural conversation about lifeboats, about crew training, about passenger-to-boat ratios, did not come. Not yet. That conversation would be deferred for nearly 60 years, until another ship, far more famous, made it impossible to defer any longer. The Titanic sank in 1912. The public inquiry that followed produced some of the most comprehensive maritime safety legislation in history. International agreements on lifeboat capacity, requirements for lifeboat drills, rules about distress signals, watch protocols in iceberg zones. The SS Arctic sank in 1854. The lessons were available then. The structural failures were identical in kind, if not in scale. Insufficient lifeboats. No enforced evacuation protocol. Crew behavior that prioritized self-preservation over passenger safety. But the Arctic's victims had no iceberg mythology to attach to their story. They had no RMS prefix, and no wealthy British aristocrats whose deaths could pressure governments into action. They had a fog bank, a wooden hull, and a set of broken pumps. And they had crew members who rowed away. The story is uncomfortable in a way the Titanic story is not. The Titanic allows us to mourn. The Arctic forces us to judge. And when judging is too painful, forgetting is easier. There is one more thing worth saying about this. The concept of women and children first, the Birkenhead drill, became maritime custom, not because it reflected human nature. It became custom because human nature, left to its own devices, produced the Arctic. It produced outcomes so morally intolerable that societies decided to build a counter-instinct through protocol and law. We are not naturally noble in crisis. We are naturally terrified, self-interested, and oriented towards survival. The nobility, if it exists, is engineered. It is drilled. It is enforced. The men who raise their children to believe that a good man stands back and lets others go first, those values were not inherited from some ancient moral tradition. In large part, they were responses to disasters. They were lessons written in the names of 320 dead people. Clara Collins, Henry Collins, Mary Ann Collins, every woman, every child. 320 people who died not because the Atlantic is cold, not because fog is dangerous, and not because ships can sink, but because nobody had yet decided that the men near the boats had to wait. If you want to understand where civilization actually comes from, not from philosophy books or political speeches, but from the specific, hard-won decisions that societies made after watching themselves fail. The Arctic is one of the clearest examples in history. America chose to forget this ship. The least we can do is remember it. If this story made you think, if it changed the way you understand why we have the rules we have, share it with one person who would appreciate it. And if you want to go deeper into the disasters that quietly rewrote civilization, the next video is already waiting for you on screen.